You may or may not be very familiar with the work of the Royal School of Church Music. We are an educational charity whose mission is to develop, support and nurture church musicians and to encourage the church to make the best use of music in worship. The RSCM was founded back in 1927 by Sir Sidney Nicholson, and he could little have imagined the world of 2020, where for a time worship could only happen online and where the practical arrangements required to enable music making of any sort could be quite so challenging. But his passion for harnessing the power of music in worship and for encouraging all those that are responsible for it remains our passion today. We're glad to be able to respond proactively to the challenges the current circumstances present. The climate around us show our work and resources needed more than ever. We've had to adapt, change our offerings and show others how they must do that too, and we're working as best we can to build on our heritage, enabling new kinds of growth and development for the future. There is still much to celebrate, and the RSCM remains a stable presence alongside all those who do so much to sustain music and worship. In particular, we work to equip churches, their local communities, and their clergy, musicians and singers with practical resources and advice. Choral music remains vitally important to us, but we are not just for choirs. We want to help make churches use the best of their resources in a wide range of musical styles. The RSCM is an independent charity. We don't get money from the government or the church, but we work closely alongside the church and continue to do our utmost to help shape its future. We are thankful for all our members and supporters who enable us to keep doing this. You can join them, perhaps by becoming a member yourself, or donating, or by giving your support in a more practical way. Details of all these things are on our website, rscm.org.uk. We know that so many people value our work, but that news of what we can offer to others in support needs to be spread wider. Please help us by sharing in that task. Thank you.
Good afternoon and welcome to the very first in a series of lunchtime lectures from the Royal School of Church Music, which has been supporting church music and musicians since 1927. My name is Tim Ruffer and I'm Head of Publishing at the RSCM. Over the coming weeks, we'll be hosting a number of lectures on a wide variety of church music, on subjects including hymns and the First World War, Sarum Wright in pre-Reformation Salisbury, J.S. Bach and the Liturgy, and Bernstein's Chichester Psalms. Today we welcome Magnus Williamson, Professor of Early Music at Newcastle University. Welcome, Magnus, and thank you for agreeing to be our first lecturer.
Thank you.
So Magnus will deliver his 40-minute lecture, and then we will have time for questions and answers. If you have a YouTube account, you can put your questions in the chat feed. I'll collate them and put them to Magnus on your behalf. You can also use the chat feed to tell us where you are joining us from. At the end of the lecture, I will also be giving out a code for anyone, the non-RSCM members, who wish to become an individual member of the RSCM for a year at a 10% discount. So, over to you, Magnus.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you very much for joining us. I've timed this paper on the short side because one of the things I've found during Zoom conferences, of which one has a great number as an academic in 2020, is that someone's speaking very quickly and it's just at that moment that your Wi-Fi cuts out. So I'm going to try and speak at a speed, hopefully not too somnolent, but at a speed which is hopefully outage proof. Anyway, who will remember with much fondness the great lockdown of 2020? For church musicians in particular, this has been a challenging year. The accustomed regular cycle of choir rehearsals, organ practice and sung services has been entirely displaced by months of uncertainty, political flip-flops, travel restrictions, economic turbulence, and all around us, the creeping virus. Reading this gloomy greeting, one of our 16th century ancestors may well say, Welcome to the 1550s. After Henry VIII died in January 1547, his three surviving children succeeded each other at bewildering speed. Religious policy swerved from left to right with each turn of the dynastic dial. The economy tanked, and sickness was endemic, whether it be the plague or sweating sickness or the weird strain of flu that claimed the lives of the composers Nicholas Ludford in 1557 and John Shepherd in 1558. Amidst all this, church choirs were disbanded under Edward, re-established partially under Mary, whom you can see on the left here, and then withered on the vine during the long reign of Mary's half-sister Elizabeth, here seen as a young woman on the right before her transformation into Gloriana. From the musician's viewpoint, the 1550s marked an emphatic watershed for all sorts of reasons. I'll return to this idea in a moment as it frames how we think about Tudor music manuscripts. But permit me to return briefly to our own plague year of 2020. One hesitates to say it, but it's not all been bad news, has it? Necessity has begotten invention, and many choirs have successfully migrated from the physical reality of Victorian pews to SoundCloud and YouTube. For us academics, 2020 has been entirely unceasing, a year of Zoom calls, asynchronous learning experiences, and online conferences. But by good fortune, we're also now surrounded by digital source materials. And here a vote of thanks to those libraries who have shared their collections online. The British Library, the Bodleian, Christchurch Library, the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, and the Bayerische Staatsbibliothek, to name just a few. Thanks to these digital heroes, we can mull over artifacts such as this innocent-looking Renaissance woodcut of a choir of adults and children singing from a choir book held open by lead weights. A simple picture, but one with lots to tell us about the Renaissance experience of singing Renaissance music. What's in those books on the base of the lectern? Is that fellow on the far left beating time or just adjusting his clothes? Is there a book on the other face of the reading desk? The two-dimensional image being beamed to you via the internet makes one think about the very three-dimensional realities of singing before the advent of social distancing. Encountering a Renaissance music manuscript is almost always a multi-sensory experience. The touch and the smell of 500-year-old books imprint themselves unforgettably on the memory, and the visual format of a great manuscript, great Tudor manuscript such as the Eton Choir Book, sparks the imagination. We see here in this picture 5 voice parts written out in separate blocks on the opened books, each voice part beginning with its own illuminated letter. And we can easily imagine the singers standing around it, each reading their own part and praying to dear God that they didn't skip a beat. This manuscript is indisputably the most important music book from 16th century England. In 2018, it was inscribed in the UNESCO Memory of the World Register. And it has also won perhaps more dubious accolades of commercial commodification in the form of napkins, available from spoonflower.com, and from the same source, tablecloths, yours for only $89, with free postage if you order an $18 face mask as well. Alas, the face mask is out of stock. After you've finished your coffee, you can gather round and sing John Brown's brilliant 8-part motet, O Maria Salvatoris Mater, which is printed on this tablecloth. I'll dismount my moral high horse here. These products are backhandedly acknowledgements of the iconic star quality of the Eton choir book. And in any case, modern commerce has nothing to teach the Renaissance about exploiting musical notation of visual bling. If you visit Hardwick Hall, a few miles off the M1 motorway in Derbyshire, you will find sacred music by Thomas Tallis in the marquetry work of the Elizabethan Eglantine table. And we find four-part polyphony embroidered on a German tablecloth from the 1560s. You can see the musical notation in the square margins between the figures of the dancing people and the musicians. This is probably a wedding gift. And you can imagine in the 1560s a companionable after-dinner entertainment for the long winter evenings as the newlyweds share their food and their tableware with their dinner guests who join them in song. Renaissance diners might also be expected to own their own cutlery. Here is an Italian knife from the first half of the 16th century, now in the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. On one side of the blade, you find the grace before dinner. May the three-in-one bless those things we are about to receive. And once they'd finished their dinner, or in this case his dinner, the primus tenor who owned this knife would simply flip it over to read the Thanksgiving grace from the other side of the blade. And there are three other knives from the same set, which are now in the Philadelphia Museum, but in less good condition. These objects reek of sociability. Their owners must have been leisured gentlemen or affluent merchants rather than working musicians. But we occasionally catch a glimpse of Renaissance musicians as social beings in their own milieu. One of the best examples of this comes, alas, not from Tudor England, but from Central Europe. Here we see the interior of the Catholic Church of the Holy Spirit in Hradec Králové in eastern Bohemia, now the Czech Republic. The picture on the left is a modern photograph of the church. The one on the right is a manuscript illumination from the so-called Gradual of Matus Radus, a book of plainsong copied in the 1590s for the singers of this church. Members of this choir are depicted in the foreground on the right. Here's a self-portrait of the copyist, Matus Radus, along with some of his musical handiwork, the plainsong which he copied on the right. Returning to our previous image, we see four singers standing around an opened choir book resting upon a wooden lectern. The men are of various ages. The youngest, second from right, is trying to grow facial hair in the fashionable pointy style of around 1600. The eldest singer, second from left, has a suitably patriarchal but unfashionably bushy grey beard. His right hand is poised to conduct his colleagues. As the eldest member of the group, he takes the patriarchal bassus part, which is probably why his left hand gestures towards this voice part in the opened choir book. Let's take a closer look at this. A book within a book, or a book of polyphony depicted within a usable book of plainsong. There are two colours of ink here, as you'd expect in a Renaissance choir book. The music is written in black, and the capitals and the voice parts are written in red. So in clockwise order, tenor at the top left, discantus, probably sung by the youth with the unconvincing facial hair, on the top right, altus below it, and then bassus on the bottom left. This kind of layout, with each voice part written on a separate block of the page, is the same so-called choir book layout which we saw in the Eton choir book a few moments ago. This was the traditional format for books of Latin polyphony in the Renaissance. The music depicted in the Hradec Králové manuscript is easily decipherable. As you can see from the illustration, the four voice parts are written in a variety of clefs indicating the vocal ranges of adult men. A high tenor, using C3 clef, which is the descantus, 2 baritones on C4 clef, which is the tenor and the so-called altus, and the bassus using F4 modern style bass clef on the bottom left-hand side. We really couldn't ask for a more informative three-dimensional source than this. The image gives us a piece of music. It names the composer on the bottom right, Jiří Rychnovský, or in Latin, Georgius Rychnovinus. It also fixes the piece geographically and temporally, and it tells us how many people sang it and what voice parts they took. And if you want to go down a musicological rabbit hole, it tells those of us who obsess about early performance practice the combination of voice parts depicted here provides evidence against a particular and persistent fallacy in modern performances, namely the use of falsetto voices in the performance of Renaissance polyphony. That's a topic which usually gets the conversation going. And better still, the music here isn't just ornamental, it is actual music. You can actually transcribe it. And this is what it looks like in transcription. It's a setting of a widely circulated paraphrase of the Matins responsory De Cantabat Populus Israel. And Rychnovsky's motet is perhaps less gratifying to the ear than it is to the eye. What we see here contains errors which are not mine, I hasten to add. But that's not really the point here. Even the choice of text itself is a self-conscious assertion of the importance of sacred song in this Bohemian town. If we return to the wider context of the picture, we can put our singers into their social milieu. The organ and its gallery are sumptuously painted and gilded. Money has clearly been invested in the parish's counter-Reformation worship. The singers are dressed expensively in black, a difficult pigment to get right in early modern times. They wear elaborate ruffs around their necks, and their self-confident bodily postures, like their clothing, suggest high social status. They evidently enjoyed significantly higher esteem within their parish community than did their downwardly mobile colleagues in Elizabethan England. And there is something performative in their masculinity, along with their musicianship. Let's look briefly at another late Renaissance choir book, this one from the court of Albrecht V, Duke of Bavaria. Copied in the 1560s, this lavishly illustrated choir book was produced for the Ducal Kunstkammer, or art collection, as much an objet d'art as a working music manuscript. There is music when you turn the folio that we're looking at, but the book is absolutely full of pictures. An expensive and very high status coffee table book. Gathered around the lectern, we see the members of the court chapel or Hofkapelle at work. And here is a group singing polyphony, a group of nearly 30 singers, an exceptionally extravagant chorus by 16th century standards. Included in this chorus are adults and children, as well as the composer Lassus. There is an audience, and we quickly notice the large cage-like screen dividing singers and clergy from the courtiers beyond. And on high, behind the gilded image of the Virgin Mary, we see a gallery and balustrades. Connected to the ducal apartments, this gallery would have given privileged access to high-status listeners. Alas, alas, there is no comparable depiction of the Tudor court, but we know that an upstairs-downstairs arrangement of this type was the norm in English royal palaces such as Greenwich, Whitehall, or Hampton Court. The architecture is different here in Munich, but this image conveys something of the experience of singing in a royal court chapel, the working environment of Thomas Tallis, William Byrd, and their contemporaries. Let's cross the Channel from Bavaria to England and travel back in time a few decades to the earlier years of the 16th century. This is the age of the Eton choir book of Robert Fairfax and of Henry VII. At this time, choir books are still the normative book format for singing polyphony in England, a fact that would change a few decades later. And the largest choir books were those used in the households of the king and the senior nobility, and in the more affluent cathedrals, monasteries, collegiate and parish churches. We normally catch only tantalizing glimpses of these manuscripts in the inventories of long-lost book collections, but a few survive. British Library Royal Manuscript 11E11 was copied by Netherlanders for the court of Henry VIII in 1516. This is in prestigious large format, although not as large as the Eton choir book or the Munich choir books, one of which we saw a moment ago. It wasn't, as far as we know, used in worship by the Chapel Royal, but it exploits the large page format of choir book format as a vehicle for heraldic display. We see here different versions of the Tudor Rose, the Royal Standards on the left, the flag of St George, foreground left, heraldic devices, the Welsh Dragon and the Greyhound of the Tudors, also the Tudor portcullis you can see in the middle of the barbican in the foreground. There are two flowers behind the barbican, the marigold of Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's sister, and the daisy or Marguerite of Margaret Tudor, another sister of Henry VIII, who was at this time Queen of Scotland. So it's very rich in heraldic meaning, this image. Turning the page, we see the canonic motet Salve Radix. It's a musical tour de force, a pitch spiral canon that uses the rules of musica ficta to send the pitch of the piece slithering around the circle of fifths. But the idea of the round serves as the context for the ubiquitous Tudor royal rose, a courtly equivalent of the roses that festoon the nave of King's College Chapel in Cambridge. This isn't the only surviving Henrician coffee table choir book, and there were others now lost. Choir books such as the, quote, Great Book of Masses, unquote, which belonged to Henry VIII's natural son, Henry Fitzroy. This book of Fitzroy's was evidently a visual as well as a musical showpiece. In the words of the Tudor inventory, it was noted cunningly with crafty pricking all on parchment. In other words, the style of musical notation was eye-catching, perhaps because of the use of coloured notation in order to convey complex times and proportions. An often overlooked corollary to large-scale choir books is the furniture with which they interacted. We saw the Munich Hofkapelle a moment ago, but we can also look closer to home to see how song interacted with architecture. The Eton choir book is a famous survivor, but it is all the more valuable because we also have at least some of its original visual surroundings. An academic might say it's architectural paratext. The most conspicuous of these surroundings is a series of wall paintings that show the miracles of the Virgin Mary. Most of this choir book's repertory is indeed concerned with Mary's power as a saintly intercessor. So while you're singing your motets from the choir book, there are depictions of the power of Mary to intervene on your behalf in life, but particularly after you've died, to intercede with God and Christ for the health of your soul. And Eton is also fortunate to have one of the few surviving double-headed lecterns from before the Reformation. This image gives an impression of the scale and weight of this object, as well as something of its architectural context. We see behind the work of dismantlement going on here the miracle paintings in the distance. I should say, ignore the splendid William Hill organ with its tubular pneumatic action and its linoleum rolls of pipework. 500 years ago, the arch behind the organ was open and gave view to the college's antechapel beyond it. Only a handful of this sort of lectern survive in England. From left to right, King's College, Cambridge, that famous lectern given by Robert Hackenplant to King's Chapel. And we see that in use every 24th of December when we watch carols from King's. Next up on the second from left is a revolving lectern from Yeovil Parish Church in Dorset. This probably wasn't from Yeovil originally. It's been speculated that it was from London, or the London area, from Middlesex. Third from left, or second from right, we see a very intricate double-headed desk at St George's, Windsor, which seems to have been adapted for reading Bibles after the Reformation. And on the right, the brass, very polished brass lectern from Merton College, Oxford. These relics of pre-Reformation song have been hidden in plain view. Since the 1550s, they've been used not for singing from, but for reading the Bible. At the Reformation, polyphonic song was driven to the margins of worship, both physically and metaphorically. But wherever you find an image of a pre-Reformation choir in an early source, you will usually see them standing in a huddle behind a lectern of this type, reading all from one choir book. Here we see perhaps the most famous image of this type from the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. And here are just a few others. Top left from East Anglia, bottom left from the court of Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy. And next to them, one image we've seen before and one we haven't. Both of these are 16th century woodcuts of singers performing music, almost certainly polyphonic music. You can just about see bottom right that the choir book has a mensural notation in it, so it's not plain song. And you find this sort of image everywhere. Turn the pages of a late medieval psalter, and you'll find a huddle of singers nestling inside the capital C of Psalm 97, Cantate Domino, Canticum Novum. And they will almost certainly be depicted reading from a single book. I should say here that the image on the top left is one of these cantate initials. You can see the large coloured letter C. Sometimes usually they're reading from a book, but sometimes from a scroll. Here we see the same image of Jean Ockeghem and his colleagues singing, here from a scroll. And the earlier cantate initials from the 14th century almost uniformly show the singers with scrolls. And it would be easy to assume that these depictions are somewhat schematic, idealized, or even caricatures. But actually, they're probably quite true to life. Here are some surviving rolls of motets from just this time, the 14th century. Motet rolls, or rotuli motetorum, from the 14th century. These are high status manuscripts, copied to a high standard. And here they are with the musicologist Professor Peter Lefferts providing context to show their scale. And rolls continued to be used alongside books well into the 16th century, although the surviving examples usually contain only one voice part. Here we see Cambridge University Library, Buxton 96, where there's the bass part of one of the Eton Choir Book motets, John Brown's Stabat Mater Dolorosa. And here, in Arundel Castle Archives, we see the bass part of another piece devoted to the Virgin Mary. The text, Gaude Flori Virginali, is commonly associated with Thomas Becket, but is a poem on Mary's 7 joys. In both of these cases, is a bass part which we find copied onto a separate roll. Perhaps we should envision a group of early Tudor singers, adults and children, gathered around the lectern. Standing behind them, at the back of the group, is a grumpy old bass, too short-sighted to see the choir book and not rich enough to afford a pair of spectacles, unlike our friend Jean Ockeghem. He reads from his own voice part, which, after the motet is finished, he rolls up again, takes home, and returns to his box of musical rolls. We find these kinds of possessions in the inventories, the post-mortem inventories of early Tudor singers, men such as William Bridgeman of Bristol in 1524, or Henry Brewster in 1518. And Brewster was the choirmaster in the household of the ill-fated Edward Stafford, 3rd Duke of Buckingham. He was executed in 1521. The choirmaster, Henry Brewster, brings me to my final topic, the teaching of Renaissance singers. Look carefully in an early music book and you will often find evidence of teaching. We often overlook this evidence because it's found in ugly little books that look so much less interesting and appealing than large manuscripts such as the Eton Choir Book. Just like spoonflower.com, we musicologists are easily seduced by glamorous film stars, when indeed the most interesting discoveries are often to be found among the repertory actors, theatre troupes, and understudies. I'll look at a couple of these in a moment, but first we'll take an archaeological turn. There's a lot that we don't know about vocal training in the Renaissance, but we are less ignorant perhaps than we might think. A century ago, a wall painted with musical notation was rediscovered in Windsor Castle. This was a schoolroom in which the choristers of St. George's Chapel had been taught song before the Reformation. The style of the notation painted on the wall is typical for the late 15th century. The note shapes, indeed, are almost identical to those we find in the Eton Choir Book. Alas, too little of the surface survives for us to know exactly how this notation was used, but clearly the boys were being taught how to read mensural notation, using some of the basic forms of ligature or compound note shapes. And I show here on the right the signs used for a pair of semibreves, an ascending ligature going up on the top and a descending ligature below. Literally beneath our feet, we sometimes find evidence for the use of slates by apprentice composers as a way of working out their ideas. Printed music manuscript paper only came into use around 1530. So in Wells Museum, we find a pair of slates incised with 5-line staves and compositional sketches, which, judging by the note shapes, are 15th century. And similar examples have been found at Paisley Abbey and in Ireland. A more recent discovery was made in the ruins of Battle Abbey in Sussex. Here, a fragment of smooth slate is incised with neatly ruled blank stave lines, but without musical notation. This provided a surface onto which musical notation could be written, either directly with chalk or by etching onto a thin layer of wax superimposed that could then be melted and erased, a device which might remind children of the 1970s of the Etch-a-Sketch, which you might have had back in about 1976. Italian musicians of the Renaissance called this kind of writing surface a slate, a cartella. From this we can deduce that polyphonic music was taught at Battle to the boys attending the Abbey's ordinary school, and can thereby make some educated judgments about the musical life of the Abbey in the early 16th century. Jumping forward a few decades to the 1570s, we also see signs of master-pupil interactions in some of the surviving Elizabethan manuscripts. The so-called Hammond part books are one of those ugly ducklings generally overlooked by musicologists. but they're interesting. We see here a page from one of these part books with polyphonic notation copied onto printed staves. This is a setting of Psalm 67, Deus Miseriatur Nostri, by the mid-16th century composer Robert Johnson. If we take a closer look, we see a confident, neat hand copies out 5 notes in classic 16th century lozenge shape before a very scratchy, wobbly, irregular hand takes over and eventually gives up writing in diamond shapes and just uses the easy round notation. Clearly, the teacher began copying and then handed the work to his apprentice, who was probably a chorister at King's College, Cambridge, as suggested by Roger Bowers and Catherine Butler. Another part book from the same stable enjoys one of the same copyists as copied the Hammond part books, is British Library Additional 47844. This is a lone survivor from a set of 5 books, but this didn't begin life as an institutional part book. This wasn't used in services, and it wasn't copied for any form of collective worship as far as we know. Instead, it was probably the private possession of an Elizabethan music lover. The first observation to make about the book is its size. So far, I've shown an unhealthy preoccupation with big books, but this book is tiny, the same size as a piece of A4 paper folded twice. For any organists who might still be listening, Additional 47844 is exactly the same size and weight as a very important fictional series about railway locomotives. So this is a portable book, probably a very personal possession, and, like the knives we saw a few moments ago, an artifact which could only be activated in company with other people. We can perhaps imagine a group of friends gathering for dinner. The plates are cleared away, and the diners reach into their pockets for their part booklets before they start singing their songs. These diners were probably amateur musicians. Why? Well, the standard of copying is good, but look carefully at the beginning of each piece. Each is numbered sequentially. We see here numbers 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and jumping forward a bit, 19. But also, just before the clef, just before the music starts, next to the title, or the incipit, the first word, we see a seemingly random series of numbers. So here we see 8, 8, 5, 0, 1, 9, 5, 15. It sounds like bingo or the National Lottery, and it would be nice to think that these are the key to a secret code shared by a group of conspirators or spies, but not so. These are simply an indication of the pitch difference between the first note sung at the very beginning of the piece and the note on which this particular voice part enters, not a device needed by a professional musician. So in number 19, bottom right-hand side, we look at a modern edition of John Shepherd's Libranos Salvarnos, here called Salvarme, untexted. And when you look at a modern edition of this piece, lo and behold, you find that our voice part here enters 2 octaves, or indeed a 15th, above the first note, which was sung by the bass, hence the number 15. There are many more nuggets to be found in the surviving Tudor music books like 47844, but this sociable little part book provides a convenient endpoint for us as we contemplate lunch. Like our Elizabethan diners, I have a few little part books up my sleeve in case anyone asks an opportune question. In the meantime, I'll conclude by wishing everyone very good fortune, an early end to lockdown, and, God willing, a successful vaccine. It would be great to see the back of social distancing, if only because this would give me, selfishly speaking, an opportunity to resume some very interesting experiments we've been having with choir book singing. Here you see members of Toby Ward's wonderful group Ensemble Pro Victoria rehearsing in Hexham Abbey using Newcastle University's Newcastle University's choir book lectern a few months ago. We did this in March 2020, just before the first lockdown, and hopefully we'll be bringing the lectern singing show to a venue near you sometime in 2021. Thank you very much. Tim, I think you need to unmute.
Thank you, Magnus.
Was I muted?
No, you weren't. Well, rookie schoolboy error there. Thank you so much, Magnus, for an absolutely fascinating, relevant and thought-provoking lecture. Before we get on to the questions, we know that some of you may have to go now, so thank you for joining us for this free lecture. If you're staying, now would be a good time to send us some comments, which I can then pass on to Magnus. Please consider making a donation, however large or small, to support church music and musicians. The details are on the screen now, or alternatively, if you wish to take advantage of the offer of a 10% discount on a year's individual membership of the RSCM for new applications, then make a note of the code which will appear below in a minute. Full details of the benefits of individual membership can be found from the homepage on the website rscm.org.uk, and just pop the code in when asked when you fill out the online application form. Crucially, this code will expire at 5 p.m. next Thursday, so don't delay. Finally, before we move on to the questions, next week's lecture will be delivered by Anne Harrison from Durham and will be on the topic of hymns and the First World War. So, Magnus, let's see what we've got. The first question is from Michael Grave. Bearing in mind who could and could not read in Tudor period, what social status a person would sing in the choir or sing in choirs?
This is a fascinating question, and I'm going to answer it sort of backwards by saying that between around, let's say, the 1450s and the 1550s, there's a kind of exponential growth in literacy. So with the spread of literacy, there comes a spread in training how to read music, and many of the engines of literacy are foundations which have musical choral traditions attached to them. I actually have a picture on this. That's a nice illustration of, yeah, here we go. I'll go forward. No, sorry, I don't have it. I deleted it because I didn't think it was interesting enough to show people. But I do have a lovely picture of a school book from the late 15th century, which is used for both grammar teaching and for musical training, teaching kids how to read plain song and how to improvise on a cantus firmus. It's very difficult to say in, say, 1540 what the proportion of the population would be who could read music. But we know there's a lot of people who didn't themselves read were read to, and a lot of music was memorized, partly because lots of the musical sources have uncorrected mistakes in them. And if you tried to sight read from them, and if you just relied on those sources just to read from, the performance would collapse. It is a time in which we could have ended the 16th century with sort of substantial literacy rates with people reading music. Unfortunately, the Reformation stopped it in its tracks. and things went into a decline. And the social status of musicians declined after the Reformation as well.
That's very interesting. One question that I had was, church music styles at the beginning of Henry VIII's reign were very different to the beginning of Edward VI's reign. I'm thinking of the compositional style of Shepherd and early Tallis, which has a huge vocal range and is quite complex in comparison to the more restrained work of, say, I don't know, Thomas Morley, which has quite a brevity to it. Other than full-blown Protestantism, are there any other reasons for this change in compositional style?
Yes, Morley was a great reformateur who saw himself as being a sort of a champion of a sort of continental modern norms of composing. So he's a kind of modernizer, and for him, slimming down keeping a slimmed down ensemble, for instance, was an important adjunct to good techniques of counterpoint. So he talked about the big lavish scoring that you might have around 1500, as talked about as the great compass. So great compass scoring has basses down on a modern bass clef, sopranos or trebles on a modern G clef, and everything in between. So you have sort of 3+ octaves of notes, and that narrows at the Reformation. So there's a compositional argument to say, okay, rationalize the number of voices that you're writing for, but that's only part of the argument. One of the things that happens at the Reformation is that certain styles of composition, certain repertories, just immediately go out of use. So in 1548, the old style so-called votive antiphon, which was one of the great technical showpieces of the first part of the 16th century, the biggest opportunity to write extravagant melismas, to use the full number of voices, going up to 9 voice parts in some cases. That repertory just stops, and you get a progressive cutting away of the more elaborate genre, leaving only the simpler ones.
Yeah, I mean, you sort of consider Tallis himself, where you have a speminalium for 40 voices, and then the total simplicity of "If Ye Love Me," and it's almost irreconcilable to feel that they are all the same composer.
Yes, but the composer mastered it was like a barrister. They mastered the brief, and there's a huge kinship between, say, like Thomas Tallis and, say, William Byrd or Robert Parsons writing in a certain genre. That you'll see, Tallis, where Tallis or Shepherd will put their, I'm writing a simple Edwardian anthem hat on, and they're experienced practitioners who know how to write simple polyphony. Simple polyphony had probably been used before the Reformation for kind of wet Tuesday mornings in November, or Sunday Friday mornings in November. But that was then the only permitted style. Of course, looking at something like Speminalium, not written for church. So you could write whatever you liked as long as it wasn't for church. Of course, Oliver Cromwell famously enjoys listening to Latin motets in Whitehall Palace as long as it's not in worship. So that you get this great hinge point around the 1550s. It could all have been different if Mary Tudor hadn't died. If she and Philip of Spain had had a surviving heir, England would have been a Catholic country probably, and the geopolitical future of Europe would have been completely different from what it was eventually what happened. But that did happen, and because that happened, composers like Byrd and Tallis were able to write polyphony, especially if they're paid. Someone probably commissioned Tallis to write Speminalium for use probably in Nonsuch Palace in the rotunda there. But it wasn't written for church, so you get this switch from church to chamber.
Okay, got a ringer here, a certain humorist from Derby. What aspects of the manuscript of all four parts on discrete the idea of falsettists, altos?
They discredit it because the overall compass described by those clefs and the resulting vocal ranges can all be sung by tenors and basses. You only see men depicted in that image from Radek Krylové, and the clefs depicted in that image, sung by those four men, simply don't require anyone who can't sing in a changed voice.
We've got a couple of questions from Jonathan Rennett. I'll come back to his first one, but there's this second one first as well. Didn't mention that most adults over 25 in the 16th century would not have had teeth. How might this have affected their singing?
It's a brilliant question. I can honestly say I've never thought of that. Probably good for melismatic singing. So I think they got all the timing wrong there, because what happens in the 1550s thereabouts is that syllables, consonants become much more important. Music becomes more syllabic. The repertories which do survive the Reformation are permitted to survive the Reformation because they convey text, and they convey text efficiently and audibly and understandably. And all the time I'm using those words as if I was still a chorister of Westminster Abbey being encouraged to project the words down to the end of the nave so that the little old lady can hear them. That's what we were told by Douglas Guest. All the time I'm doing that using my teeth. So that's a really good point. You would have been just at this time in the middle of the 16th century that sugar, which is a double-edged subject for lots of different reasons, was really coming into use, and coming into use among the more affluent people who, yes, were the more active music makers. So that flippantly, maybe that explains why so many Elizabethan part books are textless.
Yeah.
I haven't answered the question, I know, but
no, but it's good. Jonathan's other question was, do you have a formed theory on the reasons for the close relationship between organists and trains? Which, of course, there has been an article on that very subject in Church Music Quarterly.
Oh, has there? Oh, brilliant.
Yeah, I can't remember. It was maybe 2 or 3 years ago.
Oh, right. Oh, good. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you for the tip. I'll read that one. Oh, where do you start? There are so many stories. We could fill a whole afternoon. I think it's about systems, isn't it? Organists tend to be, they like things that are noisy, mechanical, slightly complicated, yeah.
Perhaps letting off steam.
Yeah, right.
Especially if you're dealing with trebles.
I had to put my hands on. I'm completely guilty here. I had a train set as a kid, as you've probably guessed by now, and the full set of W. Audrey stories. Yeah.
Certainly in Salisbury, I think it was Alcock that actually had one of those train sets that you sit on in his back garden that the trebles would much enjoy on a regular basis. I have one final question myself. I think you were involved in the early organ project with John Harper. How much of this music, due to church music, would regularly have been accompanied on an organ, do you think?
Again, there's the threshold 15, the watershed 1550s are really convenient here, because anything before the 1550s, as far as we know, and that's sort of going back a century towards the mid 15th century, and we don't know what happened before then, really. But the century preceding the Reformation, the organ is used, as far as we know, exclusively in alternation with singing. So it plays the odd numbered verses of hymns. It plays in alternation in anything strophic, like a Kyrie or a Magnificat. And organs, this is talking about church worship rather than organs being used in the chamber. But in the public spaces of worship after the Reformation, there's a transformation because the organ starts at that point to be used accompanimentally in the 1560s, 70s to accompany verse anthems, maybe to accompany metrical psalms. We don't know. There's no, as far as I know, evidence about the use of organs accompanying metrical psalms until later. And of course, we know that they're used for preludes by the time of John Reading at the end of the 17th century. But as far as we know, it was the verse anthem that was probably the main propellant of that trend of accompaniment organ music. And the amazing thing is that they stuck with the old 5-foot pitch standard, which necessitated complicated transpositions on the parts of organists, mainly perhaps as an excuse to show off their technical skills. But the organ, interestingly, remains extremely conservative, based on 5-foot pitch standard, all the way until the 1670s.
Mm. There's another one here. Given the difficulty in singing from a choir book, especially if you're as blind as I am, do you have any surviving accounts of a performance falling apart? Nice.
Very good question. I don't know of one from Tudor England. There are a couple of glimpses that you get. Fox's book of, it's not one that was that fell apart, but it was hijacked. In John Fox's martyrological, the Acts and Monuments, he talks about the Windsor martyrs who nearly included Marbeck and did include Robert Testwood, who was burnt at the stake in 1543 as part of the Prebendaries plot. And one of the things that was alleged against Testwood is that he hacked a performance of a piece of Fairfax, Laudar Vivi Alpha et O, where one of the counterverses or solo sections, which had the words O Redemptrix et Salvatrix, addressed to the Virgin Mary, O Co-Redeemer, O Co-Saviour, which is an anathema to a Protestant. He hacked it and said Nec Salvatrix, Net Redemptrix, which means neither nor. And of course, that didn't please the clergy at Windsor, which is a royal college, which is probably a bit provocative. It didn't fall apart. There's another source, the rules for the parish clerk at Faversham in Kent. Doesn't specifically talk about choir book performance, but it talks about the improvisation of Far Burden, usually used as a 3-part thing, which harmonies you improvise upon plain song. And there it says that if it breaks down, the parish clerk, who was the chief parish musician, should resume his the normal line, which would be the proper plain song. So clearly they did envisage things not being optimal in terms of performance, and it must have broken down at some point. There's a lot that we don't know about the performance standards of Renaissance polyphony. Walk through the door of Eton College in 1500. Would it be Hyperion standard recording going on?
Probably not. Question from Mary Price. Part books without text, would they have been used for recorders or viols? Or was it just the copyists being lazy and not putting in the words?
Both and.
Right.
There are lots of Elizabethan sources specifically. It's really post-Reformation that you find this, that you find new music, but also pre-Reformation music being repurposed, stripped of the text apart from the first couple of words. And clearly some of these were for viol consort. It's well known that the style of viol consort writing initially is really vocal. So the people who are writing viol consort pieces, people like Christopher Tye, are working church musicians who use their normal style of composing, but with the kind of adapted music, they are in books which almost certainly were used by instrumental players, viol players, recorder players, and so on. As Marie, you say. Also, people singing textlessly using psalmization syllables, ut, re, mi, fa. One of the key sources, I think it's British Library Additional 31390, is an Elizabethan table book, where the voice parts are laid out in various alternations, and literally you put it on a table, so a very sociable after dinner book. And the title page of that is called A Book of Soul-Faring Songs.
Quick question here from Fiona. Where is the Faversham reference? It's a church musician from Faversham.
The modern, I don't know where the manuscript is. The modern edition is in a book published by, I think, the Henry Bradshaw Society, called The Clerk's Book of 1549. And that you can get on archive.org.
Okay. So Magnus, I think that brings us to the end of our time today. Thank you so much for providing a fascinating insight into Tudor music and for answering all the weird and wonderful questions. Viewers might be interested. Might be interested to read Magnus's article in the June edition of CMQ, Diplomacy in Song 1520, which refers to the European influence on Tudor music, specifically from the field of the cloth of gold. As I mentioned earlier, next week's lecture is on the topic of hymns and the First World War, so it's very topical at the moment. And if you wish to donate or become a member of the RSCM at a discount, the details remain on the screen for a few minutes. Thank you all very much, and I hope you'll be able to join us again same time next week for the next of the RSCM lunchtime lectures. Thank you, Magnus, and thank you everybody for watching.